Welcome to Boring History for Sleep. Tonight, we invite you to step into a world long forgotten by time, a world of quiet hardship, simple living, and long, bitter winters. A world where the sun rose late and set far too early, where warmth was a fleeting memory, and the cold was a constant companion. A world where survival was not a guarantee. Tonight, we journey back to the medieval world, to a time before electricity, before central heating, before hot water came from a faucet, or thick blankets arrived in the mail. This is why medieval winters were brutal. But don't worry. You are not there. You are here, safe, warm, and still. Wrapped up in your blankets, protected from the wind, with nothing at all to do except close your eyes and listen to a story from the past. Let the chill of history roll gently across your thoughts like a fog drifting over an empty field. Let your mind slow down, let your breath settle. We are going far away now, away from the modern world, away from traffic and time and glowing screens. We are walking down a long, frozen path, through bare trees, under a pale sky, where the air smells of smoke, and wood, and snow. We pass through ancient woods, through creaking branches heavy with frost, until we arrive at a tiny village. The roofs are thatched, the doors wooden and weathered, smoke curls from crooked chimneys, and every footstep crunches in the hard, icy ground. It is winter in the medieval world. A world where time moves slowly, like candle wax dripping in the dark. Here, life follows the rhythms of nature, and in winter, nature sleeps. But this sleep is not peaceful. It is survival. When the last harvest is done, when the final apples are picked, the people prepare for the long stretch ahead. Days shrink. Shadows grow. The cold presses against walls made of wattle and daub, as wind seeps through every crack. There is no glass in the windows. Just thin animal skins, or shutters to keep out the worst of the frost. You can hear it now, the groaning of wood, the moan of the wind outside, as if the earth itself is sighing. Inside the home, the hearth glows dimly. Smoke lingers in the air. The family huddles together near the fire, wrapped in wool, wrapped in silence. They speak softly, if at all. Food is rationed. There is no feast. Only what was stored, and hopefully not spoiled. And as the night stretches on, they wait. Wait for the sun to rise just a little earlier. Wait for the snow to melt. Wait for spring. But spring is a lifetime away. For now, they live in the cold. And we, in our warmth, can simply listen. So settle in now, deeper and deeper. Let the story unfold like frost on a window pane, slow, intricate, and quiet. Let yourself drift as we begin our journey. Through the frozen fields, the dark forests, the echoing stone halls, and the windswept roads of the medieval winter. A time when the cold was constant and history was anything but kind. This is the beginning of why medieval winters were brutal. Before the frost arrived, before the first flake of snow settled on the fields, there was a quiet sense of urgency. The medieval year was a wheel. A great circle, turning with the seasons, and as summer faded into autumn, the spokes of that wheel began to turn a little faster and a little colder. For those living in the countryside, which was most people, the coming of winter meant one thing above all else: preparation. There were no supermarkets, no delivery wagons rumbling through cobbled streets. There was only the earth, and whatever it had yielded during the warmer months. So, the final weeks of autumn were filled with work. Endless, necessary, exhausting work. In the fields, the grain was threshed, separating the edible wheat from the tough, useless chaff. This was done with flails, long, jointed sticks, rhythmically pounded on the sheaves of grain, again and again. The sound of flails echoed through villages. A dull, hollow rhythm, like a heartbeat against the earth. In the orchards, apples were plucked and carefully stored, wrapped in straw, placed in cool, dry corners where they would hopefully keep through the long dark. Carrots, turnips, onions, and parsnips were dug from the soil and packed into root cellars, buried in sand or straw to prevent the creeping bite of frost. Cabbages were hung upside down in barns. Beans were dried and tied in bundles. Herbs were strung above the hearth, to dry slowly in the rising heat. Everything had to be done by hand, slowly, methodically. Every piece of firewood was split with an axe. Every log hauled by arm or cart. Families worked together, children gathering kindling, elders mending blankets or sharpening blades. In the barns, animals were brought in from the pastures. The cows, the pigs, the chickens, all housed close to the home, if possible. Not just for their safety, but because their body heat helped warm the nearby living quarters. The air inside those small cottages was thick. Thick with smoke, with straw, with damp wool and the scent of animals. And still, it was cold. Even before the snow came, the cold crept in. People watched the skies carefully. They read the signs in the trees, in the winds, in the behavior of birds. A sudden silence in the woods might mean a storm was coming. A sharp shift in the wind might signal the first frost. There were no forecasts, only instinct. Only memory. Passed down through generations. Gather the last of the berries, a mother might say. Turn the soil once more, an old farmer might mutter. Winter will come early this year. And sometimes, it did. Sometimes, the frost arrived before the grain was dried, before the onions were pulled from the ground. Sometimes, the rains came too heavy, and the stored hay mold in its stacks. Sometimes, the pigs grew too thin to butcher. Or the chickens stopped laying before the eggs could be preserved. In such years, there would be hunger. Because everything depended on autumn. A good autumn could mean survival. A poor one could mean starvation. But once the work was done, once the fields were empty, the animals penned, the carts stored and the doors shuttered, there was nothing to do but wait. Wait for the cold. Wait for the dark. Wait for winter. And so, the people waited. They sat by the fire spinning wool, mending clothes, praying quietly to whatever saints they believed watched over the seasons. They told stories. They whispered old folk tales of spirits in the snow, of wolves in the woods, of creatures that walked the icy roads. And they waited. As the last leaves fell from the trees, as the breath became visible in the morning air and the ground hardened beneath their boots. The world was slowing, preparing for sleep. But sleep, in winter, did not come easy. Because soon the wind would rise. Because soon the wind would rise. The snow would fall. And everything would become harder. The last warmth, before. When we imagine the medieval winter, we often picture the cold outside. Snow drifting across open fields, icy winds howling through the trees, frozen rivers glinting under a pale grey sky. But in truth, the real cold was inside the home. Medieval houses, particularly those of peasants and labourers, were not built for comfort. They were built with what was nearby. What was cheap? What could be shaped by hand and joined with mud and straw? The most common rural home was a humble structure of timber posts, with woven sticks in between, daubed with a mixture of clay, mud, animal dung, and chopped straw. Wattle and daub, they called it. It kept out the rain most of the time, and stood up to the wind unless the wind was strong. But it did not keep out the cold. Even the best sealed cottages had cracks. Gaps between timbers, uneven doors, broken shutters. In some homes, the roof was little more than thatch, dry bundles of reeds or straw, layered thick but not impenetrable. The wind would sneak in. And once it was in, it stayed. There was one source of heat in most homes: the fire. It sat in the center of the main room, sometimes in a crude hearth made of stone, sometimes just on a patch of cleared earth, a blackened space that hissed with wood and ash. The fire had many jobs. It cooked the food, boiled the water, dried the clothes, lit the room, and warmed the people. But it was small, and wood was scarce. Fires could not burn all day. Not when wood had to be chopped, hauled, and hoarded like treasure. So the fire was lit only when it was needed. In the early morning, to chase away the frost. In the evening, to cook the stew. Then it was banked, covered in ash, and left to smoulder through the night. Smoke filled the room. There was no chimney. Not in the homes of most villagers. Just a smoke hole in the thatch above the fire, if that. Smoke stung the eyes. Clung to the walls. Colored every piece of cloth in shades of gray. It made the air heavy. Hard to breathe. But it also helped preserve the thatch, and even killed off certain insects. So they tolerated it. They sat in the smoke, wrapped in layers of wool and linen. Children huddled near their mothers, old men leaned close to the flames, coughing gently. The floor beneath them was cold and hard. Packed earth, swept daily with a bundle of twigs. Sometimes straw was scattered to soften the tread or keep things dry. But the straw had to be changed, or it grew mouldy. Above their heads were the rafters, thick with hanging herbs, strips of drying meat, bundles of garlic, and coils of rope. And maybe, just maybe, a small loft where children slept. If the home was large enough. But most families slept in one room. Together. Not for convenience, but for warmth. There might be a single bed, a low wooden frame stuffed with straw or hay. Maybe covered with rough spun sheets, or a woolen blanket, if they were lucky. Parents slept in the bed. Children curled on the floor nearby. And sometimes, animals came in too. Not just dogs or cats, but goats, chickens, even a small pig. They were brought in on the coldest nights. Their warmth was welcome. Their noises familiar. In the deep silence of winter, even the sound of snuffling hooves was comforting. The air inside the home always smelled of smoke, damp wood, sour wool, and the slow, simmering stew kept warm at the edge of the fire. Meals were simple. Thick porridge made from barley, or oatcakes cooked on a flat stone. Pottage, a kind of stew, with beans, onions, leeks, herbs, and if they had it, a little bit of meat. Salted or smoked. Sometimes only broth. Sometimes only bread. And if the bread had gone stale, they would soak it in broth. Every crumb, every drop, was precious. They ate slowly, silently, sitting close, eyes flickering in the firelight, listening to the wind scratching at the shutters. And when the meal was done, they cleaned what they could. They said their prayers, or repeated old rhymes passed down through generations, words to keep the darkness away. Then they slept. Fully clothed, wrapped in cloaks and scarves, bodies close together beneath heavy wool. The fire died down, and the night stretched long. So very long. 9, 10, sometimes 11 hours of darkness. No clocks. No lamps. Only the slow shifting of embers, and the occasional creak of the roof as snow piled high above. Dreams came and went, half-formed thoughts, prayers for a milder morning. Outside, the stars burned cold. Inside, the family slept. And the cold stayed with them. A quiet, inescapable guest. Food, famine, and the edge of hunger. Food was everything. It was survival, it was comfort, it was the line between life and death during a medieval winter. And unlike today, when we open a cupboard, or press a button, or make a list and walk into a grocery store. In the medieval world, winter food was what you had prepared. No more. No less. There were no imports from warmer countries. No fresh tomatoes in December. No bananas. No coffee. No sugar. Only what had been grown, raised, preserved, or foraged before the frost arrived. So in November, the people waited and watched as their stores grew smaller and the cold grew stronger. Preservation was an art passed down carefully from generation to generation. Meat, if they had it, was salted. It was rubbed with salt until it wept liquid, then hung to dry in the cool air. Or smoked over smouldering wood. Long strips of bacon, curled and hard. Sausages strung across beams. Dried fish stacked in baskets. Eel, if the river had been generous. But meat was rare. A peasant family might slaughter one pig in the autumn and make it last for months. Every part was used. Nothing wasted. The blood was caught and cooked into black pudding. The fat was rendered into lard, kept in clay pots, and used for cooking. The stomachs and intestines were cleaned and stuffed. Bones were boiled for broth, and even the hooves could be used to make glue. The rich had better stores. Barrels of salted beef, spiced wine, wheels of cheese aging in stone cellars. But even they were not immune to hunger. Crops could fail. Cellars could flood. Rats could sneak in. And snow could close the roads. Famine did not care for status. And famine was never far away. One bad harvest, and a village could starve. A long winter, and the grain stores could run dry. A late frost in spring, and the new seedlings would wither before they grew. It was a tightrope, and every winter was a step along the edge. Grain was precious. Wheat for the wealthy, barley and rye for the rest. Grain was ground into flour, if you could pay the miller. Bread was the staple of every meal, thick, dark, often sour. In some regions, peasants were forbidden from using the Lord's oven. They had to bake their own, on stones by the hearth, or inside clay domes built into the floor. Sometimes, if flour was short, they would stretch it with bark, or crushed acorns, or dried peas ground to a fine dust. These were known as famine breads. Hard, bitter, and barely edible. And when even that failed, people foraged. They scraped lichen from tree bark, boiled it into soups. They dug up roots, ate wild nettles, cooked moss. Some boiled leather from old shoes. Some made broth from bones they had already used, once, twice, 3 times. Children cried with hunger, and mothers told them to sleep. Sleep so they wouldn't feel it. And still, life went on. The body adapted. Belly shrank. Movement slowed. The senses dulled. People became thin, hollow, quiet. They dreamed of summer, of green fields, of berries and cream and bread with honey. And then, if they were lucky, the hunger passed. The days grew longer. The sun began to return. The snow turned to slush. And the first shoots of spring appeared. But many did not live to see it. Winter took its toll. The old, the sick, the very young. In some years, it was worse than others. The Great Famine of 1315 followed a series of wet summers and failed harvests. People ate grass. They dug up the dead. Some said they sold their children for food. The records are few. And what we have is written in a cold, quiet hand. But hunger leaves little behind. It is not loud. It is not glorious. It is slow. It creeps in like the cold. And in the medieval winter, it was always near. So they prayed. To saints, to spirits, to old gods whose names were nearly forgotten. They whispered over their bowls. They clutched their beads. They waited. And always they hoped. Hope in the dark. That was winter. Illness, death, and the long night. As winter deepened, the world seemed to narrow. Paths disappeared beneath snow. Fields vanished beneath frost. And the human body became vulnerable. For in the medieval winter, it was not only hunger that threatened, but illness. The cold weakened the body, slowed the blood, dampened the lungs. A simple cough could become something worse. And there were no hospitals. No antibiotics. No warm clinics with clean beds and humming machines. Only herbal remedies. Old prayers. And the stubborn hope that the fever would break. Illness was not rare. It came with the cold. With the damp straw. The smoky air. The crowded rooms and unwashed hands. It crept through the village in silence, like a shadow just beyond the firelight. Children were especially vulnerable. A cold could turn into pneumonia, a fever into convulsions, a rash into something deadly. And when the snows came heavy, there was nowhere to go. No healer could travel the frozen paths. No midwife could cross the icy stream. No priest could arrive before the end. And sometimes the end came quickly. A shivering, a burning, eager stillness. And then silence. The silence of a house emitting a voice. The silence of a mother who speaks no more. The silence of the hearth burning low. In some winters, whole families vanished, especially in plague years. Though the Great Plague came later, in the 14th century, disease was always a presence. Fevers, coughs, wasting illnesses with no names, no cures, only time. Sometimes, the sick were laid on straw mats near the fire, covered in every scrap of warmth the house could spare. Herbs might be burned, mint, lavender, rosemary, to cleanse the air. A warm broth was fed, spoon by spoon, slow as snowmelt. And the family waited for life or death. In noble houses, there were physicians, men trained in ancient texts, who studied humours and offered leeches and tonics. They, too, had little power over winter. A nobleman with a fever was as helpless as the poorest shepherd. Death was everywhere. It came not with drama, but with a whisper. And when it did, the body was washed, wrapped in cloth, and carried out into the snow. Burials were simple. The ground, frozen solid, made digging a grave nearly impossible. Sometimes, bodies were kept in barns, or caves, or beneath the chapel floor, until the earth softened. They were covered in hay, watched over by candles, and mourned in quiet. There were no wreaths, no marble stones. Just a name whispered into the cold wind, and a life remembered by the flicker of a fire. And still the night went on. The night in winter was long. 9 hours, 10, sometimes more. The dark pressed against the windows. The silence hung heavy. There was little to do. Candles were precious. Oil even more so. Fires were banked to conserve heat. So, they sat in darkness. Some spun wool. Some mended tools. Some stared into the coals, thinking of spring, of summers past, of those they had lost. Sleep came in stages. Not all at once. There was first sleep and second sleep. People would wake in the middle of the night, pray, stir the fire, whisper to one another. Then return to bed for second sleep. This was normal. The body obeyed the darkness. It did not resist. And as the cold deepened outside, the people retreated inward. Into dreams. Into memories. Into the comfort of things that could not be taken by frost. There were stories. Tales passed down through generations, told in low voices near the hearth. Stories of old heroes. Of beasts in the woods. Of saints and sinners, and the thin line between. These stories gave shape to the night. They made the dark seem smaller. They reminded the people that they were not alone. And when the embers glowed faintly, and sleep returned, it was deep. Because winter was exhausting. It demanded everything. And if they did, then life would begin again. Faith, folklore, and the fear of winter. When the nights were long, and the world was quiet, something else crept into the medieval home. Not the cold, not the hunger, but a presence just beneath the surface of the ordinary. A whisper in the dark. A breath in the woods. Winter was not just a season. It was a threshold. A time when the boundary between the seen and the unseen grew thin. And so, the people turned to faith. And to fear. Faith came in many forms. In churches, priests lit candles against the gloom. They read Latin prayers in cold stone chapels, where their breath rose like smoke, and the pages of the Bible turned stiff with frost. They preached endurance, penitence, and divine order. The cold was not just a weather pattern. It was a test. A punishment, perhaps. Or a refinement of the soul. Hardship made you holy. And the poor were closest to God. But beyond the church, beyond the walls of the abbey, there were older stories still. Older than Scripture. Stories passed from grandmother to grandchild, from hearth to hearth, whispered with care. Because winter was a dangerous time. Not only for the body, but for the spirit. The forest, in winter, was a different world. Silent. Watching. And in its depths, things waited. In the dark folds of European folklore, winter was a season of spirits. Of creatures that wandered in from the cold. The wild hunt, they said, galloped through the skies on stormy nights. A host of ghostly riders, led by a shadowed king, sweeping through the clouds in a blur of hooves and howling. To hear them was an omen. To see them was worse. And so, on blustery nights, people stayed indoors. Doors bolted. Windows shuttered. Fires burning just high enough to keep away what might pass by. There were other beings too. In Germanic lands, there was Frau Perchta, a winter goddess, or a witch, depending on the tale. She wandered from house to house during the 12 days of Christmas, checking whether children and servants had been good and whether work had been done. If they had been lazy, she was said to slit their bellies and stuff them with straw. A cautionary tale, perhaps. But still, offerings were left. Bits of food. Bowls of porridge. Just in case. Even in Christian households, these stories lingered. For belief in saints and scripture did not erase the fear of spirits in the snow or creatures in the wood. They coexisted. Faith and folklore. Side by side. Prayers to Saint Nicholas and charms carved into door frames. Crosses drawn in ash. Sprigs of holly hung to ward off evil. It was all part of winter. Because winter was mysterious. The dark made everything uncertain. Shadows moved. Voices echoed strangely. People disappeared in snowstorms, or slipped through ice, or never came home from the woods. And when that happened, when someone was lost, people didn't always blame the cold. Sometimes, they blamed the old gods. The forest folk. The fae. They lit candles at crossroads. They rang bells at dusk. They told stories to keep memory alive and to keep fear at bay. And sometimes, those stories helped. Because a story, even a frightening one, gives shape to the unknown. It draws a line between the natural and the supernatural. Between what we can explain and what we cannot. In winter, that line was very thin. And so, people watched the skies. They watched the woods. They walked carefully on moonless nights. And above all, they remembered. That winter was not just ice and snow. It was the time when the world changed shape. When spirits moved more freely. When the veil thinned. and belief in something larger became more than comfort. It became survival. Lords, castles, and winter in the manor. Not all people in the medieval winter suffered in the same way. For those born to wealth, to land, to names written in old Latin scrolls and embroidered on silk banners, the cold was different. Still cold, but quieter. Still hard, but softened by luxury. The lords, the ladies, the nobles of the land did not live in cottages with smoke-filled rafters and earth-packed floors. They lived in castles, in great stone halls built to endure, to defend, to tower above the countryside. But stone is not warm. And inside these castles, winter still found its way in. The walls were thick, but cold to the touch. Floors were made of flagstone, or wood, or rushes laid over dirt. Ceilings high and draughty. Windows were few, narrow, and covered with oiled cloth or thin panes of horn. Later, in wealthier castles, there was glass. But even that did little to stop the chill. Fires burned in great hearths, vast enough to walk into, with logs the size of a man's arm. Servants tended the flames day and night, feeding them, stirring them, banking them deep in ash. In the great hall, where the Lord dined, heat would rise toward the rafters and vanish. So they sat close to the flames. Tables were set with heavy cloths, trenchers of bread or wood, pewter goblets, glazed pitchers. Above, tapestries hung from the walls, not only for beauty, but to help hold the warmth in. Thick-woven scenes of saints, battles, and hunting parties lined the rooms like woolen memories. And still, the cold crept in. So the nobles wore layers. Tunics, lined cloaks, woolen hose, fur-trimmed sleeves. Fox, marten, and ermine, if the family was wealthy enough. Clothing was not just fashion. It was insulation. Women wrapped themselves in heavy gowns, veils drawn close. Men pulled on lined boots, thick gloves, and wide belts with daggers at their sides. And even then, hands went numb in the corridors. Bedrooms in castles were rarely warm. Fires were not always lit in each chamber. Wood had to be carried in, ashes removed, smoke drawn up through narrow flues. And so, beds became fortresses of their own. Great, four-posted frames, hung with curtains, stuffed with straw mattresses and layers of blankets. Some beds had warming pans, shallow metal trays filled with coals, passed between the sheets before sleep. Still, breath misted in the cold morning air. And yet, within these walls, life went on. There were feasts, especially in midwinter when the days were shortest. Boar roasted on spits. Minstrels played slow songs. Jugglers, fools, and storytellers made the rounds. Tables groaned with pies, cheeses, wine, and gelid meats. The lords were generous, sometimes. On feast days, villagers might be allowed in, given loaves of bread, bowls of broth, or tokens of coin. Not often, but enough to make hope linger. There was also hunting. Even in winter, when the snow lay thick on the ground, and the trees stood bare, nobles mounted their horses, called the hounds, and rode into the forest. Hunting was not only sport, it was training. For war. For control. For status. To hunt was to rule. And in winter, when the prey was easier to track, the lords showed their prowess. Foxes. deer, wild boar, all brought back to the castle, flayed, dressed, and laid out for feasts. There were also games indoors: chess, dice, board games with ivory tokens, lessons in Latin or music, embroidery for noble women, scribes copied books by firelight, stewards counted grain, pages polished armor in the cold. Winter in a castle was busy, not desperate. Not like in the village, where every ember was counted, and every meal was the same. But even in these stone halls, people grew restless. The wind howled through towers. The cold cracked the mortar. The water in the basins froze. And so they told stories too. And they waited, just like the rest of the world, for the thaw. Community, chores, and the rhythm of winter days. Even in the heart of winter. Even when the frost clung to the windows. And the wind howled through the bare trees. Life continued. It slowed, yes. But it did not stop. Because even when the fields lay still and the soil was locked in ice, there was always something to be done. The medieval winter day had its own rhythm. Soft, slow, but steady. The sun rose late. In the deepest part of winter, the dawn might not come until well after the morning chores had begun. A faint grey light, barely enough to see by, creeping over the horizon like a shy visitor. And with it came work. The kind of work that warmed you because it had to. Tending the animals was first. The cows, if there were any, had to be milked. Even in the dark. Even in the snow. A wooden stool. Cold hands. A pail beneath a slow-dripping udder. The barn, or more often the lean-to shed, offered little protection from the wind. And yet, this was how the day began. After milking, came feeding. Hay for the cows and goats. Scraps and grain for the chickens. Whatever could be spared for the pig. Water had to be broken of its ice. Hooves checked. Pen swept. And then, if you were lucky, you returned inside, where the fire was just beginning to catch again, its glow fighting the chill that had settled overnight. Someone stirred the embers. Someone else prepared the porridge. Oats, if they had them. More often barley. Boiled slow, over the coals, thickened with yesterday's broth, or seasoned with wild herbs dried months ago. It was not a feast. But it was hot. And that was something. The day moved forward in soft steps. Children might spin wool. Mothers mended cloaks or stockings. Fathers carved tools or repaired fences when the weather allowed. Older villagers told stories, supervised, or simply sat by the hearth, listening. In wealthier villages, there were blacksmiths, coopers, weavers, and tanners. But in smaller hamlets, everyone did a little of everything. Chores were constant. Firewood had to be brought in. The floor restrawed. Pots scrubbed. Ashes carried out. And on the better days, if the sun was out, there might be washing. Not with soap as we know it, but with lye made from wood ash, mixed with warm water, poured over clothes spread on stones or boards. The stream, if not frozen, became the place for quiet labor. Hands red from the cold, cloth stiff and heavy. Even in snow, they washed. They mended. They repaired. Because everything had to last. And every object had a purpose. Nothing was thrown away. Not a worn cloak. Not a cracked cup. Not a broken comb. Each item repaired again and again. Inside the cottage, the rhythm of winter became a kind of music. The hiss of a pot over flame. The soft murmur of thread passing through cloth. The distant creak of snow shifting on the roof. And beneath it all, the quiet knowledge that this was how people had lived for centuries. Together. Not isolated, but bound to one another. In winter, community was more important than ever. Neighbors helped neighbors. One household might have spare apples, another, extra grain. One man could mend boots. Another, sharpen blades. There were shared fires. Shared stories. Shared burdens. And in the evenings, when the sky turned black again, and the stars blinked coldly over the fields, the villagers gathered. Sometimes just a family by the hearth. Sometimes more. Cups passed from hand to hand. Old songs hummed beneath breath. Laughter, low and slow, drifted through the smoke. And for a moment, the cold receded. Because winter was not just endured, it was lived through, together. Not with comfort, but with care. Not with plenty, but with presence. And every task, every quiet gesture, every simple act of keeping, was a defiance. A way of saying, we are still here. The snow may fall. The night may stretch long. But within these walls, the heart of life still beats. Slow. Steady. Strong.